Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar where we are digging into the 2026 data from the Education-Led Growth Research Report. My name is Shannon Howard. I am the Senior Director of Customer and Content Marketing at Intellum, and I have the pleasure and privilege every month to host these webinars and connect with you all to talk about whatever our topic of the month is. And so these webinars, Intellum hosts them every month just to invest in the community and to share with you all the things that we're learning, that our customers are learning, what's happening in our industry, and how do we all adapt. And so our hope for you today is that as we're talking about education-led growth, that you see maybe yourself in these numbers, or you see some opportunity in these numbers, and it inspires you toward your next step in your education program. So before we dive in, just some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. So if you want to come back to it, if you want to share it with a colleague, if you've got to drop off halfway for a meeting, totally understand. We're going to send that webinar recording to you after the webinar is over. The chat box is open, so feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're calling in from. I know our speakers today, John and Anderson, and I can say for myself for sure, we love to hear from you. We want to know who's on the call today so we can say hello, engage, and interact with you as we're going throughout the webinar, so that chat will be open and everybody can see and interact with each other there. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question as we're going, we'll probably save some time at the end for Q&A, but we might also take some questions, I guess, as we're going. So if you have a question maybe about a data point or something that John and Anderson have said, go ahead and put it in that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. That just helps us kind of track all the questions that have come in so we can make sure that we get your questions answered. And then the last thing I'll say here is just at the end of this webinar, you're going to receive an automatic survey from Zoom Webinars. So once you close out the webinar, it'll just pop up in your internet browser. And if you can take a moment to leave us some feedback, this helps us to understand what's working, what do you want to hear more about, what did you like, what did you not like, because we create these for you, right? So we read all of that feedback, and then in the same way that maybe you do a smile sheet, you do a performance evaluation after training, we want to hear from you too. So that really helps us to create great webinars and offer those to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Anderson and John to introduce themselves before we dive into the content, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I'm Anderson Campbell, and I lead Customer and Partner Enablement for Intellum. So in addition to being interested in the education-led growth framework and research from an Intellum perspective, I'm also interested from a practitioner perspective, because a lot of the things that we talk about in the education-led growth framework and the changes that we're seeing in the landscape are reflected in the work that I'm doing. So I've kind of got a foot in both worlds, both the research side of stuff, and then this stuff shapes what I get to do every day as well. So that's me. John.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. I'm John Lay. I'm the CEO and lead analyst of Talented Learning. We're an independent global organization that studies the learning system market and basically tries to figure out what all the competition can do inside that marketplace and keep track of all the innovations that are happening, especially on the extended enterprise side of the equation of customer and partner and association and training for a business standpoint. I've been doing that for 13 years, but 30 years inside the learning systems industry, starting as an instructional designer all the way back at the beginning. But one of my favorite topics is what we're talking about today, though I hadn't been calling it that for the 13 years, the educational led framework. But the concept of that, of tying it to measurable business results, has been like what we've been about since the very beginning. So I'm super excited about this webinar today, and let's get going.
Awesome. So maybe on that point, we'll kind of start at the top. What is education-led growth? Anderson, I'm going to turn it over to you. We've got a little bit of a definition on the screen here, but then we'll kind of walk through the framework. And we're just starting here, right? Because maybe you're joining us for the first time today, in which case, welcome. You're in really good company, and we're glad to see you here. But just making sure we're on the same page about terminology. And when we say education-led growth, what does that actually mean? What is this framework that we're talking about that this data is anchored in? So Anderson, take it away.
Yeah, and I won't insult your intelligence. You all can read what's on the screen there. But I think the important thing about what all of this is saying is that the premise of the education-led growth framework is that it's not education isn't just a support function for your employers, your employees, or your customers, or your partners. It's not something that's kind of like a bonus that you only need when you're a mature company. that education-led growth can drive real business outcomes aligned to your revenue and retention and adoption goals. That education creates a measurable business impact. And as John was just saying, like for a lot of years, people in this space have been saying that education drives business outcomes. What the education-led growth framework does, I think, is gives us maybe a common language that we can use to structure how we think about and architect and deliver and report out on how education does drive measurable business impacts. And these are those pillars within the education-led growth framework. There's seven of them. And I think it's important to like understand even in this slide that even though these are laid out in a particular order, they're not necessarily sequential. You don't have to like finish outcomes before you move on to audience. These kind of coexist and overlap. So it's similar to how, if you think about your business, sales and marketing and customer success, they may all touch different parts of the customer journey. And at the same time, they overlap and kind of blend into one another, function in parallel. They feed into one another and off of one another. These pillars are sort of the same way. So they're presented, I think, in a pretty logical order here from left to right. You start, I think if you're starting from scratch, you'd probably start with defining outcomes, and then you would move all the way through implementing your program, measuring impact. But for most of us, we're already in the midst of doing all of this stuff, right? Or much of this stuff, whether or not you call it that. You're engaging with these different sorts of pillars. And what the education-led growth research tells us is how organizations across different industries are actually putting these pillars into place, what they're emphasizing, what they're not. And I think some of the findings, especially from this year, when I was reviewing them with Shannon and John earlier, like these are genuinely, I think, surprising and instructive for us. So, Shannon, do you want to help kind of frame the research that we undertook before we like dive into the data?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we surveyed 190 corporate learning leaders. So these are kind of director level and above learning leaders across industries to understand what Anderson said. How are they leveraging education-led growth, and whether we've been using that framework and calling it exactly that, or if we're looking at each of those individual pillars and saying, how are we marketing? What kind of marketing resources do we have? What are we measuring? How are we measuring? What obstacles are getting in the way of being able to successfully measure our program? We're trying to capture some of that data to help you understand how are you doing compared to other businesses. Sometimes it's you're in good company, right? You're going to see some data points that make you think, yes, okay, I also struggle with this, or oh, we're also at that point in our journey. So we'll dig into just a few of these data points. So today, consider this a little bit of a sneak peek. The full report is going to come out next week, so stay tuned for that. We'll send you an email about it. But this is a sneak peek at some of the data that you'll see in the report next week. So the first question we asked about is just audience, trying to understand which audiences are people educating, right? And what's interesting is, right, a lot of folks, corporate learning leaders, are educating their employees. This could be internal learning and development, can also be sales enablement, product enablement, right? We often have internal L&D teams that are educating employees on maybe how to sell, how to service. We're educating our customers, partners, and even prospects, right? So this is kind of a swath of audiences that people are educating. And you'll see in the report that some of the data is broken down maybe by audience, by type of education program. And then we also are asking, right, in that education-led growth framework, the first pillar that you see there, and I know John will stand and rally on this hill, is starting with business outcomes. Is what outcomes are we trying to drive in our business, and really designing learning from understanding what is it that we're trying to drive in the business first, and then maybe what behaviors are we trying to change in our education audience, those customers, partners, employees, and prospects, to drive that business outcome. So we also kind of ask people against these four. And so these are kind of four buckets maybe of outcomes that we're asking people about. And within those, we have more specific, right? So if you think about retention, maybe it's customer retention, it's account retention, it's revenue retention, it's employee retention. So there's different aspects of that kind of fall into each of these buckets. But one of the things that we found in the 2026 research is that revenue and performance metrics really take priority. So Anderson mentioned when we were talking about education-led growth that for a long time, education was seen as a support function and maybe at best a cost reduction, right? We're trying to reduce the number of support tickets, or we're trying to help, educate customers at scale so that we don't need as many customer success managers, like educating people one-to-one. And that can be a great place for education to start, but it can actually do so much more for the business when we are intentional about it. So I'm going to turn it over to John and Anderson just to share a little bit more about this data point and some of the things that we found.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Andrew. You'll
no,
start.
you go ahead. You got
I
it.
think it's interesting that 81%, 0.6 are thinking revenue. I can definitively say 13 years ago that number might have been five. So how the whole industry has moved to what I think finding is the number one metric that makes training teams relevant, whether that no matter what your audience is, if you can tie it to the performance of the business and revenue of the business, that's the one that executives pay the most attention to always. And so to see the industry moving that way, whether that with employees or and all our external audiences mixed together with these survey respondents, to me was really, really surprising and encouraging for where we're going as an industry. What do you
Yeah,
think,
I
Andy?
think when I was looking at the numbers as well, I was like, well, if you're considering customer education, your customer audience, your clients, if you're considering your partners who you're working alongside to generate revenue for the business, seems like there's more of a direct line there. So of course, like your education is hoping to drive revenue. But when we looked at the audience data, especially kind of the way that broke down this year, the vast majority of respondents this year indicated that they're primarily educating employees and educating teams. And like that seems new here that even for the internal employee education use case, there is this pressure, or maybe they're seeing it as an opportunity to connect their education programs of the employees to how they impact the business's revenue. And I don't know, that felt new to me. I don't know that it necessarily means that they have the infrastructure yet to kind of back up that story, but it seems like that pressure is very real for even internal education teams that they need to connect their internal programs to business revenue as the primary outcome.
It's interesting. Do you think maybe it's because cost reduction has a diminishing return and that
Yeah,
organizations just can't focus on that anymore because you can't squeeze any more out of it. And so you have to focus on other, maybe it's practical like that. They're just turning sideways because there's nothing else to cut.
yeah, and there may kind of speculating a little bit, but there may also be other things that are impacting and tying to cost reduction that weren't previously, other kinds of mitigation efforts. And I think that we look at like how AI is being deployed across a lot of organizations, and we'll talk more about what this survey said about AI. But if that starts kind of eating into your ability to show correlation or causation, then I think you do need additional metrics to kind of drive. And that's the other thing that I think is helpful about a model like this is that it offers several different business outcomes that education can reliably impact or drive. So you don't get
Mhm.
tied just to like cost reduction. And if you can't impact that, then what value are you? There's these other things that you can steer the business towards understanding the value of your education programs.
hmm hmm I guess one last little pile on as we move on. If you do reduce all your costs, what do you do next year or the year
Yeah.
after that? There's so little that you can do. But if you focus on how you're helping the business drive more profitable
Yeah.
business, then there's no ceiling. You can
Yeah.
always focus on that and keep on getting better at it. And so maybe that's where we're at as an industry now in 26.
Yeah.
Mhm. And maybe a good note too on this revenue number, right? Is often when we think of revenue, we think of new logo. And so if you're educating prospects and you're moving them through the sales funnel, the pipeline, and you're accelerating maybe time to close one with education, that can be great. If you're increasing deal size, right? In marketing, we've talked about this idea that an educated buyer is a better buyer, right? They're more likely to buy, they're a better customer, and education can play a role even in that marketing function, which you'll see in the research here about where in the customer life cycle even are people deploying marketing. but it can also be expansion, right? How are we introducing customers? How are we helping them to use our platform, get value out of our platform so that maybe they're using more or they're buying more or other business units within that organization are using the product, buying the product. So there's a lot of opportunities here. You could also charge for education too, right? I think that's sometimes like the low-hanging fruit option is what if we charge for education, but we've actually seen over the years organizations that charged for education making it free because they realized that the value there could actually drive more revenue in a free model than in a paid model. So there's a lot of opportunities here when we're thinking about revenue, but just in case you saw that and were wondering how are people using education to drive revenue, there are really a lot of opportunities there. Um, the other thing we asked about is how is education involved in the go-to-market strategy? Um, and so we asked them kind of where is it maybe in onboarding, adoption, customer loyalty and retention, partner enablement, demand gen, things like that. I think something that was really encouraging to see is that only 5.8% of respondents this year said that education is not currently integrated into their go-to-market strategy. So we're starting to think maybe a little bit more about how education plays a role in the business overall, not just how does education do kind of education's things. But Anderson, maybe want to kick us off here.
Yeah, and this one is particularly encouraging for me, and I think it's anchored to that 5.8% number this year because that number last year was 20%. Like 1 in 5 programs last year were saying go to market motion, like we don't play any role in the go to market motion, and that's dropped to about 1 in 20 now. I think is really encouraging because I think that signals that there is a strategic and organizational shift in how organizations are perceiving the value of education. But what stood out to me, and I have a background in go to market, what stood out to me here is where the go-to-market focus and contributions concentrated within education, because the top two things are still like customer onboarding and retention, which I think like that makes a lot of sense, right? It's post-sales, that's where customer education specifically and partner education often live, is in that kind of like the deal has been done, and so now we need to educate to drive onboarding and adoption, and then all the way through the rest of the customer journey. Um, what still seems to be growing, and I think that we're going to see more of this, are customer education or education in general involved in demand generation, upsell support, even like new lead generation. I think that there is a pre-sales motion where, you mentioned earlier about smart, happy customers. I think Sydney Sloan at G2, she says smart, happy customers buy more. But I think that that's true of prospects as well. Like smart, happy prospects, if they know more about your product or your service, and they can start understanding how your product or service helps them deliver on the outcomes that they're responsible for, they start to get a bit of an education about what you do and how they're going to implement it, then they are, I think, more likely to close that deal with you as opposed to a competitor who they know less about or they understand less about their products or services. So I think we're going to see a movement from just post-sales go-to-market share to maybe some pre-sales or nurturing kinds of things that happen as air cover within a journey, a sales journey, or maybe even in kind of the market in general, starting to educate the market more broadly about what your company's products or services are, so that you can then find those qualified prospects, qualified leads that are already starting to get informed about who your company is and what they do. I don't know, John, does that any of that match with what you're seeing in organizations that you're working with?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I guess what on a couple slides ago we saw like the heavy concentration of employees as the training. And one of the things that struck me when I looked at this slide was, internal training, employee training is different than external training. You have different priorities and goals. But one of the things that internal training has done for the last 4 decades is onboarding. And so as we see, this is the one function or one common function that both groups potentially can be great at and drive at. So it doesn't surprise me to see that as number one, as that's probably the lowest hanging fruit, especially if you're used to thinking about employees. And so that's one observation. Well, the other observation is when you drive revenue, you can drive it directly or you can be a step away from it, but still tied to it. And both are great. But the one that's tied directly to it is the 44.7 here. And so I think this is the biggest opportunity for all organizations because you bring in a educated, qualified lead, as Shannon says. I'm a recovering LMS sales guy. I know that buyers didn't want to talk to me. If they could do their research on their own and get qualified to a point before they talk to me, that would be their preference every time. Not because of me personally, I hope, but because they wanted to just not waste their time with salespeople that they didn't need. So that line item right there is like a huge opportunity for learning and development, internal or external, to support to something that is directly related. If they come into your pipeline and they buy, that is something that you can measure and take credit for. And so that's a real easy one to start tying to from a business standpoint. We're going to talk in a few slides, and so I won't give it all away here about the role of marketing to do that. So to think about that, though, you need a marketing skill set to think about how you attract somebody before they're captured after contract is way different. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's that skill set that's going to turn out to be really important in our industry now and forever, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have that part of the conversation because that's, as you know, marketing is part of my background, and so I get really excited when I can see these worlds kind of blend together.
Yeah,
Because I
me too.
think that a lot of folks in education, they have more marketing skills than they realize that they have, and
Mm.
we'll get to that part of the conversation. But Shannon, I think next we were going to look at some stuff around AI. Is that what's on the
Hmm.
docket next?
Yeah.
What,
Yeah.
AI in
Uh,
a 2026 webinar? I can't believe
I
it.
know. I
Right.
know. Are we cliche? Yeah, so you if you've been following Intellum for a while, you might know that in 2024 we partnered with Forrester to conduct some research with 300 customer education decision makers and asking them to just talk about their planned use of AI or future use of AI. And so now we're kind of living in the future that we had read about in 2024. And so in 2024, 99.6% of respondents said that they were planning to use AI by 2026 right now. And then our data from this year says 92.6% of those people are actually using AI in their education programs. So we drill into more of these use cases in the full data set here. But just interesting to see, right, that a significant number, right? This is 92.6%. That is a pretty significant number of education programs that are using education and pretty on par with what people had expected even in 2024. But John, maybe if you want to kick us off on the topic of AI, and how you're seeing it being used for education programs.
Well, it's like everything in 2026, you can't find any software, any service, anything that's not tied to AI. And so our industry is no different. And so it manifests itself, and we'll see, dig into the numbers, but across content generation, reporting and analytics, administrative help, recommendation, user experience. There's really countless different verticals of ways that it is being applied in the industry and throughout the different learning systems. And it's not, there's some commonalities for sure. Uh, Between vendor to vendor, in my experience, like kind of working on this group. Well, what's really interesting to me is because it's so new and hasn't been done before, the vendor communities all coming up with different ideas on how to solve different problems or the same problem, and they're not coming up with the same idea. And so from my perspective as an analyst, it's been really neat to just look at the diversity of what's being accomplished. But where I'll leave it with Anderson to weigh on is that in my mind, what I'm seeing is two buckets. There's the bucket of like, how can we do what we used to do better, faster, cheaper, smarter? And then there's the bucket of how can, with this new technology, how can we just reinvent this altogether? How can we look at learning in a way that's never been looked at
Mhm.
and apply it that way? We're the 92%, I think, is in bucket one. And I don't know what that percentage is on bucket two, but I think it's a lot less. I think that's more like a 10-20% maybe optimistically versus just making things better with using the available tools. What do you think, Anderson?
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on because the first question I had when I looked at this 92%, 93% number was I wonder what, like, the question that we asked was broad, are you using AI? And then we did break it down into different types of AI, which we'll see in just a moment. But like, what does adoption actually mean? Is this touching workflows in a meaningful way? Is it productized kind of AI usage? Is this I consult an LLM for some content creation and copy and paste stuff in? I think we're still early enough in trying to even understand uh, what the AI options are that are available to us, the generative AI and other. And then, as you were saying, like those two buckets of I'm using this for efficiency, create more, scale faster, like all of those buzzwords that we hear around AI today. And then we're starting to see those folks that are saying, I'm now envisioning things that were not possible before. And that I think as we look at like future iterations of this education-led growth research, I think that's an area for us to really start to press and lean into with the folks that respond, is trying to really dig deep into uh, what they're utilizing AI to create and to drive that wasn't possible before. But I mean, we did break it down some, and I think the question is, how are organizations utilizing AI today with what they have available to them? And I think that's the next kind of breakdown in data that we have.
Hmm.
Interesting. I've had a couple clients here recently where the same pattern has evolved. So they're enterprise, extended enterprise software companies. So they got multiple audiences, employees, customers, partners inside of there. And what I've started to see is like an unofficial grouping. The employee group fell much more in that bucket one of like we got the opportunity now to drive costs, to automate things, create faster. And I keep on seeing the customer education side say, how can we re-envision this? How can we not send a customer to an LMS? Is there a better way to make them use our software better and more efficiently without driving them to some island? And so
Yeah.
it's interesting to see because you have different goals in both of those. And so that's driving different mentalities with the application of AI.
Yeah. And I think I've seen the same thing. The same kind of breakdown on audience use case, like and the same places where innovation feels like it's starting to show up based on the type of customer education program that we're running. Well, when we asked folks about how are you utilizing AI in your programs, like these are the things that rose to the top. And I think there weren't a ton of surprises to me here for where we are in the AI innovation and AI adoption curve. It's not a surprise that content creation is at the top. We know that that is one of the things that's probably a bit easier for AI to automate, and it's also super time consuming on the human end. So it makes a lot of sense that that is up there. Um, I think that the more advanced use cases that we see on here, if you look kind of middle and bottom of that table, things like adaptive learning and predictive insights, that data analysis and visualization, those are more complex problems to utilize AI to solve. And I think, like in my experience anyway, those kinds of things, there are some use cases for AI that require like cross-functional collaboration. Now you're collaborating with your IT department or your finance department, and you're trying to figure out how do we join these data sets together and leverage AI to help us unpack that data or to make decisions on that data in new ways. And so I would expect that there would be slower adoption for those sorts of more complex use cases. The things that maybe can't just be productized, where you push a button and the AI Sparkle does what it's going to do. Um,
Mm.
One other observation, and then John, I'd love to get your insight on this, just generally. Another thing that stood out to me was uh, kind of the bottom left paragraph there, where it looks like smaller companies are focusing more on like adopting AI more broadly, more quickly than enterprise companies are. And I would have expected the opposite, really, where enterprise companies who have access to a lot more maybe budget and capital and AI tools, that they would plan really as a human capital um, save motion to be able to leverage AI for scalability because they're running bigger, more complex programs, and smaller companies may not have the budget to be able to invest in AI tools. So it was interesting that smaller companies seem to be saying like, "Yep, we're rolling out AI everywhere," and enterprise companies are being a little bit more a little bit more hesitant with that. So I don't know what your read on any of that is, Jim.
Mm. That's exactly what I'm seeing on the front lines. It's not all or nothing with that, but it seems to trend to those. And my working theory is, and I don't know if this is correct, but my working theory is that it has all to do with risk.
Mm.
You know, big 100-year-old companies that are global and 50,000 employees, and they've got a lot riding. They've got
Yeah.
a lot riding on risk of revenue, reputation, delivery, legal risk, all kinds of stuff. And they're already at the top, they're already global. And so, I think they're more in cautious mode. Let's use it. Let's study it. Let's make sure we're not too quick. Let's not get ahead of our skis. And then I think on the other side of the equation, it's 180 degrees different. It's like, wow, it's the wild, wild west. Let's do anything we can. Let's try to catch those big guys. Well, why are they on top? Let's do that. Well, risk, schmisk. Who cares about that? We'll deal with
Right.
that when we find it. And so, I just think there's a much, much broader, bigger threshold to accept the downsides. What can the downsides be? Well, downsides could be really big, depending on this, the miscalculation of data interpretation or creating content that gets somebody killed because the steps aren't right and it hasn't been reviewed by an expert. And so there's a lot of things that can happen that could basically put a company out of business without any rules. But as of right now in 2026, I think both are existing at the same time.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm seeing the same thing even in the client conversations that I have with Intellum as we roll out our AI features and AI capabilities. Uh, right now, those are going to an area of the Intellum platform called Intellum Labs, which allows any of our clients to toggle those on for kind of like early opt-in stuff. And when we talk to our clients about, hey, are you experimenting with these features? Are you not? If you're not, like, tell us a little bit more about what would help you with that. The smaller companies tend to be the ones that are like, every time you put something new in there that's AI, I turn it on. I want to get the benefit out of that. I want to start playing with it. And some of our larger clients are more hesitant, and they come back to us and they're saying, "You're going to have to show me your AI policy. I need legal to review your AI policy. We then have to mesh that up against our internal AI use best practices and rules." And it's interesting to see sort of like what the steps are to be able to even start utilizing AI in the products that a team has access to. And I wonder if, AI, one of the utopian promises is that it would be kind of the great leveler, the great equalizer. And I wonder if this is how small companies start to gain back some of that competitive advantage, if they can move faster and be a little bit quicker in implementation of AI and learning what those kind of frontier use cases are. I wonder if that starts to give them back a little bit of an edge that some of these enterprise organizations that maybe have huge numbers of people, huge budgets, but they can't move as quickly in response to market innovations like what we're seeing within the learning landscape as relates to AI.
Well, one can only hope for that glass half full utopian view of AI in the
Yeah,
future.
I know, right?
But
Well,
that would be
I'm
great,
waiting for
though.
my 15-hour work week.
and that's what I think, if you look at some of these numbers, is encouraging, is that people are not adopting all of it all at once, right? There's so many possible use cases. Even if you look at Anthropic's kind of like predicted theoretical usage of AI versus actual adoption of AI across industries, we're still in very early days. And I think because we've heard this narrative for so long, like it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's here, it's here, it's here, and then we feel behind, like we're actually kind of just getting started. And not to say like sit, wait, but start to invest the time and think. I know Hazel's in the comments talking about what she's doing with AI, how her team's thinking about AI. Like we should be thinking about, how do our programs fundamentally change in a world where AI is available to be used for content development and creation, or assessment creation, or data analysis, or predictive learning. We need to be building that into how we develop our programs, which to this end, Intellum recently released an AI readiness playbook. So I dropped a link to that in the chat. If you're here with us live, if you're watching the recording, go over to the resources section of the website, download the AI readiness playbook. But that's a way that you can it's just got information in there on how you can prepare your content, your teams, and your programs for AI. Anderson was talking about even working with IT, and some of the best kind of juiciest use cases for AI are not things that education alone can do, right? We're going to have to partner with our business partners around the company to implement AI for those like juicier use cases that need access to product data and CRM data and all these things to be able to provide learning right in the flow of work. So we're kind of like in this really neat opportunity where we get to be part of like what does the future of learning look like?
Yeah, cool. One thing, jump on there real quick, and I'll be fast. That's not on that list. Maybe it's because there was not enough respondents. But one of the things that really seems popular is the use of agents. The agents within a course to ask questions, agents that would basically take what questions you got wrong in a particular course or a course of study and create a personalized, adaptive course just for you personally. But then also agents that do things that help you practice. Anything from like language skills to customer service skills to pitching, a client on a product or services and doing that in a safe environment and getting that right. I see a lot of traction happening on that right now. It's really neat because it's not scalable in any way in the old way. And so all that practice is something that makes a lot of sense, but has been impractical. And so that's one I hope to see moving up on this list next year when we do this webinar, or expect to see it anyway.
Yeah.
We also ask folks, and it's funny because Hazel's talking in the chat about even just how she's measuring AI and how AI is saving her time. And John, I know you've beat this drum for a long time around like measuring the impact of our programs. We have got to be measuring, improving the impact of our programs, which starts with understanding what is it that we're trying to drive, having a plan for measuring that. So Hazel's talking in the chat about how she was measuring how much time it took her to create content without AI, and then using that as a benchmark to say, okay, now that I'm using AI for assessments or for content creation development, how much time is this saving me? And she's finding a 40% reduction in time of creation, which is great. Like a lot of people are implementing, and I'm just talking here about AI, but we're implementing AI, but if we don't have a benchmark for pre-AI, how are we really measuring the efficiencies that are being gained? But John, I'll have you start here just around how education leaders are thinking about measuring the impact of their programs. What this data kind of says to you, especially compared to what we saw last year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things I was encouraging earlier on in the slide is to see that 80 some percent that are thinking about measuring something. But all the way back to the beginning of my career, when I tripped into extended enterprise, we were a content company, and we were selling basically CD-ROMs of product knowledge to send out to partner distributors of high tech telecom companies, and that was like Compaq and Hewlett Packard and Unisys and companies like that. And if we sold a project to the internal employees, we would essentially get 1/3 less the money than if we could sell that same 1 hour of content to the people that were going to use content for partners or for their end customers inside of there. And the reason is 25 years ago, they already knew that before they developed one piece of content, they knew what business needle they were trying to move and how they were going to know if that needle moved. And so with partner and channel learning, this isn't a new concept. This has been around forever. And that's why they were willing to spend 3 times as much, because it wasn't about saving money. It was about moving that business needle. And so, what I want to see, when I looked at this particular chart, when I saw not measured at all, it's great that it's low. I wish it would be zero. But what I was surprised is that there's not more of immediately, because you shouldn't even be creating any content, in my opinion, if you don't know exactly what it is that you're trying to measure. And that measurement needs to start really with the first people that are taking that content so that you can understand what's going on and how that's working. And whether that's a weekly or bi-weekly or every month, the process needs to start yesterday and, not wait, because if you do wait for a year or more, or even 6 to 12 months, well, you don't know what happened, essentially. And so if it was an easy fix to, make it way more productive, you got to wait way too long to know. And so the sooner you know that information, the better it is to make adjustments. And if you can make adjustments, then you're going to increase your impact in a measurable way. And that's what the whole point of this webinar is how to do that. So when I look at this, I want to see 100% on the left. would be my goal if I could wave a magic wand.
Yeah, I I don't find anything like controversial in that take at all. I think that uh, I was also encouraged that there's only 5% that are not consistently measuring something. Um, I do think, when I think about measurement for programs, education programs, in my experience, I try to blend together leading indicators and lagging indicators, which allow me to measure kind of across the spectrum because there are things that you can measure immediately that will give you a sense of whether or not the direction of your program is headed where you hoped to point it, and you can make early course corrections quickly. And then I think that there are things that you need more data over more time to be able to really show the impact of that needle that you're trying to move. So increasingly, what I'm doing and what I'm encouraging other folks to do is find a combination of those needles that can be in
Mm.
each one of these buckets, right? Like, here's what the immediate impact should look like. And as I measure in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, a year, these are the other needles I expect to move, or maybe it's the same needles, but it's where I expect them to move to, so that you're not having to wait to prove out to the business. We can't afford to wait any longer, to prove out to the business in a year that something we're doing right now has an impact. But also, if you just measure stuff immediately, and that's the only measurement you're taking, that's the only time you're pulling the dipstick out, then you can sometimes kind of like overcorrect and you're turning the wheel too quickly. I think it's good to have a combination of things, but I would like to see the 5% go to 0%, and then see some sort of distribution here where we're seeing kind of every stage of learning, or every part of the journey be measured in meaningful ways.
Yeah, that's pretty astute looking back and forward like that with the leading and lagging indicators. That's
Yeah.
a good idea.
Every now and then I have one thing astute to say.
Well, and if folks are wanting to learn more about leading and lagging indicators, or you're thinking about how do I prove that near-term, long-term value of my program, I dropped a link to the guide to metrics in the chat, which has a section on leading and lagging, just different metrics that we can measure for our education program. So I'm going to be here with the resources so you can keep,
I'd
like,
say
we're
you've
talking
got a
about
resource for everything, Shannon.
I
this is
know.
the goal. This is the goal. Look, the whole goal is that you all are empowered. Like, we want you to be successful. That's why we host these webinars, do this research, create this content to help you succeed in all of these things. So more resources to be dropped in the chat. We've got two more data points. This one I think is really important because I think it's always important to acknowledge, like, there's a reason that 5% don't consistently measure, and there's a reason we don't always measure immediately, and that's because there are very real challenges that we experience with measurement, whether that's the integration of our tech stack. I was so shocked to learn that some companies, employees don't know what their company's like primary business goals or KPIs are. That there are actually some organizations where maybe you work there and you have no idea what the business is going after. Maybe you don't have access to different tools. I know someone was working on kind of a cross-functional initiative and was just given the giant no. You are not allowed to get access to the product analytics tool. You are not allowed to get access to the CRM. Like, all the data that they could use to inform their program or prove the value of their program, they were just kind of blocked from that. So one of the questions that we asked in the research surveys is, what are those blockers to success? Like, what are those things that are keeping you from being able to measure and prove the impact of your program? And so you'll notice this is not new at all, but this lack of integration between systems. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity for AI, right? Because if we really want to effectively use AI, it's kind of layered across all of these systems, right? It's not just layered on top of our LMS, like searching our LMS or pulling something up, but it's actually maybe pulling from multiple data sources to be able to serve up what people need, where and when they need it. So maybe, hopefully, next year when we do this, we'll look and we'll see that that number is lower. Maybe there's some more integration here. And then lack of clear metrics or KPIs to define success. Love to see 25.8 said none of these are obstacles for our team. So those are folks who said, of all these possible options, these are not an obstacle for me. So that was very heartening. But Anderson, you're grinning, so I'm going to let you kind of comment on that.
Well, I mean, because I had a completely different read on that number. I think is why I was grinning. Like, I saw that number, like none of these are obstacles for our team, and I'm like, well, are you sure? Like, are you measuring the right things? because I've just heard this story so many times, and Hazel put it in the chat, like gathering data from disparate systems, the struggle is real, and I think that's because it's a new motion for a lot of education programs to say we need to connect to data of what's happening in the business after education happens or before education happens in order to really tell you what needles that we're moving so that we can have a share of that success story. And that requires that you are joining data sets from the LMS and from other areas, right? From the CRM, from your support platform data. And I've not myself had a conversation with someone who didn't find that to be a challenge to get access to that data because we haven't traditionally in education had access to those kinds of data sets. So, the business cares about what happens after you educate someone. Did it work or did it not? The business doesn't care as much about your number of course completions. That's important for your program, but that's not the needle that you're trying to drive. The needle you're trying to drive is what do those educated buyers or not educated buyers, what do they do differently that impacts the business? And so I think we increasingly see a need for access to data that exists outside of the LMS or outside of our learning systems tools. And yeah, so that number was met with a little bit of suspicion by me. I was like, well, maybe you're not measuring the right thing. Maybe I'm just being cynical. That's also true because I've had my own challenges with doing this kind of data analysis and joins in the past as well.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting. You're both right, really, in everything. Shannon, it's a lot easier now because of AI and just because of the data lakes and data analytics tools. Technically, to pull this information together and draw the conclusions that need to be drawn and put that in beautiful graphs, all that is so easy technically, quite frankly. So how come it's so, why are these numbers, why does everybody have so much challenge with that? And I think it's more politically and operationally is the challenge of if you're an L&D department and you've never worked with IT, who owns the CRM, how do you make that connection? Why would that connection be made? And so I think a lot of organizations just kind of struggle with it. But now with the educational, led framework here of tying things, what's not been said is as part of this is the partnership that education has to have with the business units because that partnership with the business units and that discovery with the business units and understanding what Shannon was talking about, what the actual goals of the KPIs of that group or and how that ties to the greater KPIs, if you could have those type of discussions, then the sharing of data all of a sudden becomes much more mandatory and much less theoretical because you could say, well, geez, I can help you achieve these goals through education. And this is how, and we know it works because we've been doing it. If we could partner up here and share this data, we can prove this and we can help you get your goals. So that might seem a little, Pollyannish, but it really is true. If someone can help you achieve your sales goals or your customer support and service goals, and maybe you don't have access to the data, but I bet you the VP or the EVP or the CRO of the organization certainly could make a phone call in about 2 seconds and get you access to that, or at least start that conversation if they thought it was in their best interest to do so. So my lesson on all of this is it's not technical, it's political. And the way to do that, there's a lot of ways to do it, but one is breaking out and helping the business units achieve their goals through education, which is today's webinar.
I want to say maybe it was in 2023 research we published about the need for an executive sponsor. And that was kind of a key takeaway. If you don't have an executive sponsor, that needs to be your number one priority is go get an executive sponsor who can go make that phone call or knock down doors. Okay, last data point here, John, you kind of foreshadowed, let us hear. But one of those pillars of education-led growth is around marketing. And so we asked people, what kind of marketing support do you have? Do you have a dedicated marketer on your team? Some people actually have an education product marketer. Some people have dedicated resources for marketing where marketing has allocated maybe some time to promote education. They might do their own marketing. So the the instructional designers or program managers may be doing some of the marketing themselves. And then some people had just said, we don't actually have any marketing resources for our education program. And in the full research report, you'll see this kind of split out between internal and external audiences. How does that vary in terms of support and marketing channels? But John, since you were talking about this earlier, talk to us a little bit about marketing and just kind of what you're noticing in the research here compared to your work in the industry.
Yeah. So 30 years ago, I got a master's degree in instructional technology. And one thing I can say is that we never talked anything about marketing. Anybody comes from that instructional design, instructional technology background, you don't even have to take a marketing course. You know nothing about it. What's ironic, though, is that instructional design and marketing are two overlapping circles. They have so much in common, but it's never presented that way. So one of the big challenges, especially for employee learning professionals, is they don't have that skill set unless they acquired it somehow or realized they had a gap and wanted to acquire, but it just doesn't come naturally. And so that's caused a lot of challenge, I think, in trying to think about things from a marketing standpoint, which is absolutely mandatory, critical in the external audiences. And so as I look at this data, I would imagine it doesn't surprise me at all. It's all over the board. Depending on how big your company is, you already have a marketing department, and in some, small enough that you have to wear that hat. But nonetheless, this marketing support is absolutely critical for the educational-led framework because each program is exactly that, a product, more or less, that you have to treat like a product, understand who your target market is, your ideal customer profile, how they need it, what they need exactly, get it to them, make sure they know that it's there and they see value and they want to do it or even pay for it. All those are marketing concepts that we have to become experts on. And so as I live most of my life here in extended enterprise, when I started Talented Learning, my very first blog post of talking about extended enterprise, I called the new position the industry is going to need was an instructional marketer, where those two things come together. And that term never caught on, but the idea, I think, is more important than ever now as we tie to actual moving the business needle.
Yeah, I think that there's two things that I want to help folks maybe separate when they think about marketing, especially as an education-led growth pillar. And that is marketing as a function of the organization. So there is a marketing department and a person with marketing in their title, and whether or not you can have that person's capacity or even have somebody on your team that has marketing in their title. And then there's marketing as a function of the work that we do. And I think when we look in the responses here and we just kind of casually chat with folks, if you're in that customer education world, partner education world, it is more likely that if your company has marketing resources, you get to tap into that a little bit because there is an acquisition part of your learning programs that is almost dependent on this sort of external awareness that the education program even exists and trying to drive awareness of that program and acquire learners that way. Internal programs, you know who your employees are and you have channels that you can communicate to them in. So acquisition looks a little bit different, and you're probably not going to win like the marketing headcount battle if your primary remit is to educate your organization's employees. But I don't think that that makes marketing any less important to you. It just means that the shape that it takes is a little bit different. I mean, marketing as a function is something that can be built into, I think, any learning program. And it's really about, marketing at its base is you have to identify what a particular need is, a customer need. And if you're internal education, your employee education, your customer is your employees, right? Or your customer is the business. You have to create products or services that address that particular need. And then you need to promote them in a way that builds interest and hopefully loyalty to that solution that you've created. So you're creating the education program as a solution. And if there's for internal programs, there's the required stuff that you've got to do from compliance, you've got to do for onboarding, but where you need to get more traction oftentimes is in the skills-based stuff where you want people to opt in, you want them to self-select, and you want to be able to drive business outcomes through that additional content that employees have to work into their schedule. And if they're not aware of that, and if they don't understand how those courses, those programs are going to benefit them and their careers and the business, then they're much less likely to kind of find their way over to that. So if you're not going to have a dedicated marketing person, that doesn't mean that you can't do marketing internally to your stakeholders and market those programs to your employees. But it requires thinking about it in a little different way. I think I'll date myself a little bit, but the old field of dreams, like if you build it, they will come. That just hasn't proven true for a lot of our education programs. So we got to go out there and we got to grab them.
And that's the final resource, and you'll see it earlier in the chat here around we developed a marketing toolkit, right? So kind of in response to when we conducted the research last year, we found the majority of teams don't, right? Like the dream would be to have a marketer on your education team who's thinking about where, when, how do we deliver this education to the right learner at the right time. But most of us just don't have a dedicated person. And so some of us are taking on this kind of instructional marketer role that John was talking about so long ago. And so this toolkit was created to give you just some resources that you can use, right? So there's kind of workbook elements of it, tools and templates, lots of links and resources for you in there. But go ahead and grab that link from the chat or go and find it on the resources page of the Intellum website. This is the end, kind of the last data point that we've talked about here. So we've covered a lot. There's going to be a lot more in the full report, right? We just kind of went over a few kind of maybe key takeaways or things that we thought were significant in the research to kind of talk about today on this webinar. So stay tuned. The full research report will come out next week. So you'll see that online. Again, at the end of this webinar, you're going to see a survey form. So if you can take a moment just to fill that out, let us know. What did you like? What do you want to hear about? Just give us some feedback that helps us to improve, and then also plan out our content calendar to help you. I want to thank John and Anderson. Thank you for joining us today, sharing your wisdom, expertise, and experience. And then everybody who joined us today, thank you for taking time out of your day, for engaging in
Thank
the
you.
chat. We had a really great time, and we will hope to see you again in a few weeks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.